We'll be screen sharing them as well. Pleased now to introduce Rabbi Uhrbach. Rabbi Jan Uhrbach is the founding director of the Block Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts, which is intended to be an incubator for inventive forms of prayer and liturgy, building community through learning and meaningful shared experiences. Rabbi Uhrbach also loves being in the classroom at JTS, where she teaches courses on the meaning of liturgy. In addition to her role at JTS, Rabbi Uhrbach serves as a founding rabbi of the Conservative Synagogue of the Hamptons in Bridgehampton, Long Island. She is also a member of the Wexner Heritage faculty and has taught and served as scholar in residence in many synagogues. She's taught several times for us as part of our Monday series, and we're so pleased to have her teaching for us again today. I am going to now turn it over to Rabbi Uhrbach.
Thank you both. And I can't see everybody's faces, but Mimi, if you're here, thank you so much for sponsoring this. So let me begin. I'm just going to do a very brief overview of what I plan to do today, so you know what to expect. I've identified in the description this like it or not, pun intended, tension, in which each of us is both like and unlike each other. So what I want to do is begin by presenting the textual basis for that polarity of similarity and difference. And I want to say up front, in that regard, there's going to be nothing you don't know. And I'm pretty sure that once I show you where I see it in the biblical text in particular, it's going to seem absolutely obvious to you. But I want to then focus on what that means for us in our lives, how it plays out for us individually in the personal sphere, in groups, and in the public sphere. We'll talk a little bit about why it's so challenging, some strategies to do better at it. And then finally, we'll move back to how this particular dialectic, this tension, relates to faith and religion, and it's the implications of it for attempting to live in the presence of and in response to the divine. So first, the textual basis. We go back to the very, very beginning, Genesis 1. I gave you a couple verses in the sources. It's text number 1, 2 verses. Vayomer Elohim na'aseh adam b'tzalmeinu kidmutenu. God said, let us make a human in our likeness, like our image. And then Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem Elohim bara'oto. God made the human being, betzalmo, in God's image, in the image of God, God created it, the human, him. Okay, so most often when we encounter these verses, we focus on the most obvious of the extraordinary implications of this. And that is that every human being is entitled to dignity and respect, and no human being can claim greater inherent worth than another. Okay, but there is another aspect of this that is less commonly cited, but which the rabbinic sages already noted, and that is the paradox of human diversity and difference, all being in the image of the one God. And so here's what the Talmud says. You have it there in text number 3. For this reason was the human being created alone, to proclaim the greatness of the Holy Blessed One, of God. For if a person strikes many coins from one mold, they all resemble one another. But the Supreme Sovereign of Sovereigns, the Holy Blessed One, fashioned every person in the stamp of the first human, and yet not one of them resembles their fellow. Therefore, every person is obligated to say, the world was created for my sake. Okay, so our dignity, so we can unshare the screen, our dignity, our infinite value and worth, emerges not only from the fact that we're created in God's image, but in each of us being created unique in the world. Our individuality, the way we differ from every single other person in the history of time, requires us to say the world was created for my sake. Okay, so how is it possible for all of us to be in the image of God and yet be all different? Well, the beginning of the solution is grounded in those prepositions in the biblical text, ba and ka. Betzalmenu, in God's image, and specifically kidmutenu, like God's likeness, like but not. Right? We are not co-equal to exactly the same as God. We are similar to God, but not. Of God, connected to God, we share something, and yet we are other. So we live in that paradox, in that tension vis-a-vis God. And that helps us solve the theological problem, right? Of how can we all be different and yet all be in the image of God? But this is not only a theological problem, because then there's Genesis 2. And in the second chapter, the second creation story, we meet Adam and Eve in the garden, or we meet Adam and then Eve is created. And if Genesis 1 posits a similar but different relationship that we humans have with God, Genesis 2 raises the same tension in our relationships with our fellow human beings. Why? Because God says, Vayomer Adonai Elohim, God says, Lo tov heyot adam levado, it is not good for the human being to be alone. E'eselo ezer kenegdo. I will make for Adam an ezer kenegdo. That's by design. Eve is created to be loosely translated, one who helps by being a corresponding opposite. Eve is created from Adam, etzem me'atzamai uvesar mibsarai, right? Bone of my bone, or essence of my essence, and flesh of my flesh, Adam says, but she is not Adam. She is like him and yet an other. And the parallel to the relationship with God becomes even more explicit in the second generation. In chapter 5, verse 3, it's there in your text, but I don't think you even need to share the screen. It's one line. Adam lived for 130 years. Vayoled bidmuto ketzalmo. He had a child in his likeness, like his image. Exactly the parallel. So basically what we have in Genesis, at the very beginning of the Torah, is God saying, I'm going to create an other, a being of me, yet not me, like me, yet different. And then I'm going to give that creature, i.e. us, the very same experience. A fellow being like it, yet not it, similar but different. And that dialectic of same other is repeated, obviously, perpetually, whether it's a biological child sharing the parent's genetic material or a child partaking of the parent's values and heart and soul. We are all of our parents and different from them. And obviously, it's not just parents and children. Our dual identity as same and different is a fundamental tension at the core of every relationship. Siblings, marriages, teachers and students, mentors, dear friends, co-workers. Every relationship we have with any other person, from lover to stranger, partakes of this. We simultaneously share something with everyone we meet, and we are different from everyone we meet. And of course, the same is true with God. Okay, that's the basic text and concept, right? And once I say it, it's pretty obvious. Now let's talk about what it means. Okay, so when a dialectic like this is laid out for us in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we ought to pay attention. These chapters at the beginning of the Torah are not here to teach us about how the world or how we were created. They're not even really so much about God. Their primary purpose is to teach us some fundamentals in the human condition. What's our essence? What are the most important things to know about ourselves? So when the Torah highlights this like and unlike tension as part of our relationship with God and everyone else, it's telling us two things. First, this is an inevitable dialectic for every single one of us. None of us can opt out. Whether we're talking about the individual or the collective, it's the same question. I, you, we, they, it's the same thing. We have free will, yes, of course. So how we manage this tension, whether we do it in constructive or destructive ways, that's not predetermined. But that we have to wrestle with it, we have no choice. No one's exempt. It's one of the things we all share. Two, the fact that this dilemma is here, right in these first couple of chapters of Genesis, highlights for us the significance of it. Their enormous stakes hinge on our capacity to simultaneously embrace what we share and how we differ. We might even say the very purposes of creation hang on this. And at the risk of being overly reductionist, I want to suggest that whenever humanity goes wrong, as we so often do, overwhelmingly, it has to do with how we well or not so well manage this dilemma of similarity and difference, and we screw it up in both directions. We see only difference, and we don't see or acknowledge or feel or act on what we share, or we see only sameness, and we don't see or acknowledge or feel or act on important differences. Othering is a problem, and so is homogenization. Just some examples. If we see only difference, we end up atomized. There's the loss of connective tissue, of shared purpose, of collective responsibility. If we're only different, there's no basis for empathy and understanding. My lived experience as an individual or a group is absolutely unique, and your experience is irrelevant to mine. If we take the image of God idea and we focus only on uniqueness of each human being, well, then everyone's personal truth is equally valid and everyone's rights are equally absolute, and we have relativism epistemologically and morally. Plus, we have no room for compromise. There's no reason to limit our appetites or balance our rights and needs with others' rights and needs. No sharing of responsibility. We have no claim on each other. How lonely. On the other hand, seeing only sameness is equally problematic. We can't just join hands and sing Kumbaya, right? Why can't we all just get along and realize we're all really just one and at heart we're all the same? Well, because we're not. Or we are, and we're not. We do, in fact, have different personality styles and preferences and different bodies and cultural differences and different life histories and guiding narratives. So if I only focus on similarity, I'm actually not relating to anyone else at all. I'm relating to a made-up projection of me out there. If there's only sameness, there's no real learning or growth and no real relationship. I'm sure we've all at some point had the experience of sharing something personal and the other person saying, oh, I know exactly how you feel, or, oh, I had exactly the same thing happen to me. And you're thinking, really? Actually, no, because what you're describing is not at all how I feel and not at all what I'm trying to tell you happened to me. How lonely. So while the text and the concept are pretty straightforward, in practice, this is very challenging stuff. And I hope you are sensing by now that this simple and incredibly complicated dialectic turns out to be the linchpin of morality and ethics. It is also, I would maintain, the core of our own identities. What it means to be me individually and collectively what it means to be a Jew. How so? I'll show you a couple of texts in a minute, but first I want to just give you an example. So several years ago, I attended a synagogue program on race relationships. It happened to be in Minneapolis. The speaker was a non-Jewish Black woman, and her talk was about the ongoing impact of slavery on Black people in America. And she opened by asking the audience a question. By a show of hands, how many of you are direct descendants of slaves? and 2 or 3 hands went up. Now, it being a synagogue, I see a few hands here. The audience in the synagogue was more than 90% Jewish, and the speaker quite rightly pointed out how odd it was that only a handful of hands went up. After all, isn't our redemption from slavery one of the defining narratives of Judaism? And I'm sure if she had asked, for how many of you claim the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt as part of your identity, almost every hand would have been raised. So what happened? Well, the majority of Jews in that room happened to identify as white. And because the question was contextualized in the context of race, a Black person who happened not to be Jewish, talking about the impact of slavery on Black people, the overwhelming majority of people in that room heard the question of slavery as being about someone else's story and not their own. They were primed, so to speak, to focus on difference and not similarity. And I raise this not to speak about race in particular, but because it's a great and concrete example, at least it was for me, of the way that failing to hold the tension of losing the both and, of similarity and difference, causes us not only to see others, but ourselves inaccurately. Almost everyone in that room forgot our core narrative. Why? Because this dialectic sits right at the heart of our own identity. Who are we? Genesis tells me that I'm a particular, solitary, freestanding, independent being and a mere particle of water, so to speak, in the vast ocean of God's oneness, which means that paradoxically, I can only discover and become the completely unique self I'm created to be by being in relationship to other selves who are both similar and different. Lo tov heyot adam levado. It is not good for the human to be alone. We need an ezer kenegdo. We need a corresponding other, not just because we're lonely. It's the Torah's way of saying that we can't understand or become who we are exclusively from within ourselves. We have to be in relation to an other. Right? The idea of going off and finding or fulfilling ourselves alone is a fantasy. We know this psychologically and experientially. The Torah tells us it's true existentially. Existentially. So I wanted to show you 2 texts on this, relatively contemporary. One is, this is one of my favorites, is a piece by Amos Oz that he wrote with his daughter Fania Oz Salzberger. It's text number 4. I'll read it to you. The main intent of this passage, and they're talking about that Sanhedrin text about us all being created in the image of God, and yet each of us being unique. The main intent is to urge the utter necessity of personal responsibility over the lives of others. Every human being is a unique version of original man, individually stamped in the image of God. Only the wicked look on at other people's woes and say, what does this trouble have to do with us? The rest of us understand, in the words of John Donne, that no man is an island. But note the Mishnaic reflection on the matter of human diversity. This is a bonus insight, extending beyond the asserted importance of every soul. In principle, one could have argued for the sanctity of each human life, even if we were all essentially uniform, all resembling atom-like peas in a pod or coins in a mint. So the Mishnah has something further to tell us. Every soul is a full world, and every world is different from all others. This is not Western individualism, but Jewish individuation. The singular is not weightier than the group, nor the I more important than the you or the we. Instead, every one of us must be infinitely important to the others and to the collective, because we are each a unique variant of God's image. And I'm going to just go to the last paragraph. No man is an island, wrote the great Donne. The novelist among us adds, true, no man is an island, but we are all peninsulas, partially on our own, surrounded by the dark waters, and partially linked to a continent, to other peninsulas, to the plural noun. That's who we are. So without the connection, if we see ourselves as an island, we won't actually discover the true boundaries of who we are, because we're missing the part of us that's connected to that peninsula. If we scroll down to the next text, this is Adin Steinsaltz, Alav Shalom, from his classic work, The 13-Petaled Rose, from a mystical perspective. He says, here we have what is perhaps the second paradox of the search for self, that only by ceasing to see oneself as a supremely independent essence can one say with all sincerity, this is where I am. It is the self-obliterating view of oneself that provides the true basis of all existence, that makes possible a firm grasp of the truth of reality. For then the circumscribing immensities of existence take shape in one's own understanding, and it becomes apparent that one is part of them. Within the great circle, which includes all the levels of humanity, each person can discover the special lines of his or her own direction, the shape of his or her soul. And I'll just skip a little bit here, because even when all the souls flow in and out of the same primal source, the oneness that is God, and all similarly aspire to reach out and grow and return to this source, even then, the way of every soul, for all it has in common with and resembles all the others, is unique and justifies its separate existence. Myriads of sparks reflect the primal light, every one of them within its own situation and its own set of circumstances. Here it is right there. Only when we hold that we come from the same primal source and our soul is unique do we know who we really are. Right? We become ourselves in relation to others. We can't really see the other without seeing ourselves, and we can't really see ourselves without seeing the other. The same is true at the level of the collective. I'm going to leave this largely for another day, and we'll break for questions in just a minute. But just to speak a little bit about this, it's the same issue on the collective, just with higher stakes. From family, friends, professional associations, religions, nationality, like it or not, pun intended, we live, survive, and thrive in groups. Group identification, at its best, what we call community, is necessary and good. Right? We know this. It builds trust, increases altruism, enables us to get through tough times. Groups are a way of playing out that similarity difference dialectic without doing the work of parsing it one by one. And groups also shape and bolster our individual identities. It may be why fraternities and sororities appeal to some college-age students, right? It gives an identity, it creates a we, which helps solidify the still nascent I. Sometimes we see this a lot in our own day, we even emphasize or manufacture difference with other groups precisely in order to strengthen our own identity. We really, really know who we are, we think, when we're against or when we hate another group. It's part of the appeal of war. And I want to think here not just of actual war and peace, but culture wars, elections, interpersonal battles, any source of conflict. When in us is challenged or threatened by a them, we will feel it viscerally, primally, as a personal attack on our individual identity. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Alav Shalom, has written extensively about this question in several of his books. I recommend them, Not in God's Name, The Dignity of Difference. I want to share just one brief text about this before we break. This one is from To Heal a Fractured World. It's text number 6. So he says, I'm just going to pick up in the paragraph in the bold, peace, right? I would extend this to reconciliation, forgiveness, but peace can come to seem to be a kind of betrayal. It involves compromise and settling for less than one would like. It has none of the purity and clarity of war, in which the issues, self-defense, national honor, patriotism, pride, are unambiguous and compelling. War speaks to our most fundamental sense of identity. There is an us and a them. There are enemies and friends and no possibility of confusing the two. When enemies shake hands, who is now the us and who the them? Peace involves a profound crisis of identity. The boundaries of self and other, friend and foe, must be redrawn. Okay, so that's sort of the contours of this question and how it plays out. So let's break for a few minutes now for some questions. If anybody's posted anything in the chat.
Thank you. I can't wait to see where you're going to take this in terms of conflict. I mean, that's such a profound line about that you need to cease seeing yourself as independent from everyone else, in order to actually be a part of things. So, all right, you've whet my appetite anyway. All right, I wanted to. There was a question that I think was reacting to the Sanhedrin text, which lifts up diversity and says that right, even though we each are our own coin, we're all in the divine image, and the person is pointing out that there are also plenty of Talmudic texts that don't see everyone as equal, and she's particularly noting texts that put people with certain disabilities in different categories. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Okay, so a couple of things about that. First, this just comes from my own approach to Judaism and the study of text and what Torah actually is, which I think is deeply grounded in the conservative movement. First of all, I think our tradition evolves. Our tradition is meant to evolve. We evolve ethically, we evolve in our sensitivities, and sometimes we've gotten things wrong, plain and simple. And I think some of the texts that speak especially disparagingly about people with disabilities, they got it wrong. For some of the many reasons that I'm going to articulate as we go further about the what difference raises for us. I will also say that even with all of the various rabbinic texts that treat different groups differently, for all kinds of reasons, disparaging texts about non-Jews, different treatment of people with disabilities, I don't know of any place where it ever denies the divine image. Right. And so this question actually really sits in precisely the tension I'm raising, which is there is fundamentally with every single person something shared. That's the implication of that text in Genesis 1. We are all in the divine image, the fundamental humanity. And areas where we are different can cause us to lose sight of that or to bracket the implications of that, right? So I'm not sure what to say more than that, other than to acknowledge, yes, those texts exist. I'm grateful that to a large extent we've moved beyond them and have a different view. I will say specifically with respect to disability, we have a long way to go yet in terms of full equality, but that journey sits in this tension that I'm articulating here. Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Do you want to take one more?
Sure, let's take one more and then we'll move forward.
Okay. I'm just going to read it verbatim. Can you elaborate on the difference between Western individualism and Jewish individuation?
Yeah. Okay. So it's at the essence, and Rabbi Sachs, alav shalom, writes a lot about that too. Western individualism tends to fall on the different side of this tension and really genuinely see the individual as a being that can and does exist on our own. Right? This is where we get, it's what Jonathan Sachs would call this pathological dualism. A dualism that loses the tension of the similarity and difference and says, I'm a supreme sovereign self in my own right, and I can, in fact, define my identity and my being solely as an independent entity. Individuation is the attempt to hold the tension. It's precisely what we're talking about. Individuation says, I am both and. I am a separate person, and I am in relationship with and connected with and responsive and responsible to other people. If you think, we think about helping children grow, we're working toward individuation. We're not looking to raise children who see themselves as disconnected from everyone else in the world. We're looking to raise children who individuate, who know who they are, and remain connected and in relationship to and with other people, who feel a sense of communal responsibility, who understand that I'm shaped by others and I shape others. I think this is one of the most challenging things American culture in particular is facing right now, because we are such an individualistic culture. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's come back. So I mentioned in passing earlier that this same different dialectic is the linchpin of ethics and morality. Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, purportedly once said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, ze klal gadol b'Torah." This is the greatest principle in the Torah. So this is the ball of wax, this is the whole thing, right? Now, actually, I'm assuming many of you know, there are two V'ahavta verses in the book of Leviticus from last week's parsha. We just read it, Kedushim. Leviticus 19, verses 17 to 18 is the Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And it's contextualized as follows. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. You shall not hate your brother, your kinsfolk, in your heart. Reprove your kinsfolk, but don't incur guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Et bnei amecha, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ani Adonai, I am Adonai. Okay, a few verses later, in verses 33 and 34, these are text number 7 and 8, if you want to look at them. We get the following. When a stranger, a ger, resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. Ve'ahavta lo kamocha, and you shall love him as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I, Adonai, am your God. Okay. So these two verses capture precisely this polarity of similarity and difference in two ways. One, in the fact that one of them is directed to your kin. L'reacha, your neighbor, is interpreted as your fellow Jew because it follows b'nei achicha, your relatives. These are the people close to you. And the second verse is about the ger, the stranger, the person you see as different, the other. So, how do you treat those who seem similar to you? And how do you treat those you identify as different, the other, the stranger? Right there, the Torah is recognizing that we tend to dichotomize and categorize, to lose the both and. You're either like me or you're not. You're one of mine or you're the stranger. That's the first way. The second way that these verses capture the same different dilemma is in the kamocha, like you, but not you. Love your neighbor or the stranger as yourself, like yourself. What does that mean? So we can unshare for the moment. It doesn't mean in the simplistic sense and in the Christian formulation of this do unto others, right? It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean, well, my favorite flavor is chocolate, so that's what I'll get for you. No, what it means is just as I want both empathy and connection, and I want to be treated as the individual that I am, to be known as me, so does everyone else. I want people to get me the flavor ice cream that I like, not the flavor they like, right? At heart, the klal gadol b'Torah, the greatest principle of the Torah, is precisely a command to embrace and act on this similar difference tension with every other person. I have to know you and who you are and how you differ from me and how you're similar in order to treat you the way I want to be treated, because I want to be treated that way. I want to be seen as unique, and I want the empathy of where we connect. Right? So those two verses challenge us to do that. And by the way, some commentators say we need the second ve'ahavta command, the one that's related to the stranger, because it's harder, right? Because it's much easier to love the people who are similar to us, and we tend not to do so with people we see as different. I'm not so sure. Sometimes not. Note that the command about our relatives follows, don't hate your brother in your heart. Don't hate. Sometimes when someone is closer, more similar, more like me, it's actually harder to manage the tension because the differences can be more threatening, right? For example, there is often more tension and hatred among religious groups that are similar, that share a common ancestor, faiths, sibling faiths, than among religious traditions that are radically, radically different. It's the closeness that raises the threat. I think we need both ve'ahavta commands, your relative or neighbor and the stranger, because they're each hard in different ways. I might even go so far as to say that together they mean when you're inclined to see only similarity, when you're dealing with re'echa, your brother, your neighbor, your friend, then ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. Remember that you want to be seen as a unique individual, and your relative and your friend and your neighbor is not you. They're different. Don't forget that. And when you're inclined to see only difference, when you've identified someone as the ger, the stranger, the other, then remember, you were once, you are the other too. You're not quite as different as you think. Right? It's precisely this. Okay, so I said I would talk a little bit about why this is so hard and what we can do about it. All right. Occasionally, we find ourselves really at the extremes of the dialectic. Right? Think about falling head over heels in love with someone because, oh my God, we're exactly the same. We're not. Or on the other side, I have no idea who these people are and what universe they're inhabiting. They are a completely different being from me. They're not. but mostly we're in between. We feel an intuitive affinity or distance. It's like we're always putting on one pair of glasses or the other, one which shows similarity and one that shows difference. And we do it unconsciously, instantaneously, based on countless subtle calculations. Same, different, same, different. It's like, you know, when you go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked and they flip all the lenses, right? And you're getting like it's blurred and then it clicks into place and suddenly we see clearly. Like it's like we're doing that unconsciously, right? Or we think we see clearly. And most often we're not seeing clearly at all, precisely because those lenses of sameness and difference say as much about me as about the other person. That's the implication of everything we just talked about. Because this tension strikes at the heart of our identities and our egos, our self-preservation will hide from us the fact that we're even making choices, that we're choosing to see similarity or difference. We're choosing what to focus on. And it's bad enough at the individual level. We hurt people, and we get hurt a lot because we're not conscious of the assumptions that we're making about similarities. How could they have said that? I would never say that. Right? How could that person react? I would never react that way. If I said that, I would mean, well, that may be true of the other person, it may not be. We hurt people and we get hurt, right? And we don't even realize the way that we're turning someone else into another or assuming sameness. And the danger is infinitely greater when it comes to groups. Because at least when it's I, you, the you has a name and a face and a family and a story. And it's very hard for me not to at least see a person, some measure of sameness. When it's we, they, and they can easily become a faceless, nameless mob, then it's much easier to demonize and create cartoonish stereotypes. And it's why any form of group identity, necessary though they be, can always slide into a kind of communal egotism and a collective narcissism, right? So that's one reason this is so hard. Our ego is involved, and we're not conscious, we don't see. But it's not the only reason. There are other reasons why this is hard. For one thing, holding any polarity like this, any dialectic, it carries a heavy cognitive load. It requires work intellectually. So our brains tend to make it easier for ourselves by choosing one side or the other. That avoids the dissonance and the contradiction. And it's just easier, right? It's much, much easier in any dialectic that we have to be either one or all or the other. It's one way actually in which we are different from God, tragically so. We and God both have the capacity to hold and imagine dialectic and polarity. God can always live with both at once. We human beings, not so much. It's hard for us. And unfortunately, but our technique to reduce the cognitive load by choosing the one side of the dialectic never works. Never works. Right? Polarities like this aren't problems with solutions. They can only be continuously managed. And this polarity, being similar and different from everybody, is really a bear to manage. It's hard because it has to be managed person by person. That's one thing. Second, kinship and othering, the same difference. Each offer necessary and very seductive comforts that are hard to give up, even beyond identity. Benefits of kinship and likeness are obvious, right? As we said, without it, I'd feel alone, unknown, lost in the vastness of time and space. What would be the basis to enable me to trust, to share, to work creatively with others? I would never feel safe if I didn't see similarity. And in the best way, it's otherness and difference, my uniqueness, that gives meaning to my life, my work, my family, my school, my country, my religious group, Judaism. Without it, without seeing difference, what would make me valuable? Why would I matter? And without the ability to feel different from others, I would be completely overwhelmed by the suffering and pain in the world. I'd feel constantly vulnerable to everything that happens to everyone and anyone. Who could sleep at night? I would never feel safe. We could go on spelling this out, but I think you get the point. The comforts of kinship make it scary to acknowledge difference. And the comforts of difference make it scary to acknowledge commonality. I gave you in the packet, well, I don't want to spend time on it now together, but you can look at it on your own. I gave you a little chart that's based on like management consulting work about how to manage a polarity. And it's really about spelling out for yourself the upsides and the downsides of each side of the polarity. What's the upside of seeing similarity? What's the upside of seeing difference? What's the downside of seeing similarity? What's the downside of seeing difference? And the goal, once you identify them, is how can I stay in the upper two quadrants, the upside of both, and not whipsaw from the upside of this to the downside of that, to the upside of this to the downside of that, right? It's just about making it conscious. So you can take a look at it if you want to. But so that's the second reason why this is hard. And I want to add to that some specific things in our generations, in our culture right now, that make managing this really difficult. I mentioned Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. In his book, he identifies three things in our current culture. One, technology and social changes have made us more continuously, consciously aware of the presence of the other than at any other time in history. The existence of the quote other is like in our face all the time. All the time. Two, simultaneously, that very same technology, coupled with growing segmentation of society by income, education, and class, enables us to insulate ourselves from deep encounter with difference. We are more likely to live in a bubble in which we really hear and know only our tribe mates. So the combination is we know there are these others out there, we just never talk to them. And we know less and less about them. And we have fewer and fewer relationships, deep relationships, with people we would identify as different. And the third is what we talked about earlier in response to the question, is that the radical individualism of our Western culture has undermined and weakened meaningful communal ties which entail responsibility, and what Sachs calls the moral dimension that links our welfare to the welfare of others. Like, there's a lot of research on this. And in our society, we bowl alone. So we've lost a lot of that. And he says that creates a crisis of meaning. I want to add to Rabbi Sachs's 3 points, 2 more, as to why this issue is so hard now. And it's coming up so often now. I would expand his identification of this crisis of meaning as being also or related to a crisis of faith. I would frame it that way. And I'm not even talking about faith in God, or that too. but faith in the very foundations of society, of democracy, of institutions, in the viability and desirability of even organized religion as a constructive, beneficial enterprise. And beyond that, I think we're experiencing a crisis of faith in humanity. Can humanity, can we, human beings, be relied upon to reflect the image of God at least most of the time? I think we don't so much trust that right now. And lastly, the last point why this is so hard right now, our generations are facing challenges that especially demand working together and crossing boundaries in unprecedented ways. A worldwide pandemic, climate change, an increasingly global economy, coupled with rapidly increasing economic disparity, the greater ease of large-scale violence and violence from a distance. The list goes on and on. We are facing problems that cross boundaries. So while the likeness-otherness tension has always been a locus of fear and anxiety, right now it is an especially volatile hot button. So what do we do about it? Well, we have lots of not such effective strategies to avoid the dilemma. And usually they entail, as I mentioned earlier, some form of a false binary. Either someone else is totally similar or totally different from me, rather than doing the work of holding both, right? So I may designate some other person or group completely different. Or I want to engage only with people who are just like me. Or I self-isolate and I tell myself I'm supremely independent, right? I only need to care about me, personally or collectively. Or I tell myself I'm totally different. I would never do that. That could never happen to me. Or I pretend we're all the same by glossing over difference. My family were immigrants and we made our way. Why can't you? I'm able to fill in the blank, whatever it is. Why do you need special treatment? Or I try to make us all the same through social pressure or legislation, or if necessary, brute force. None of those strategies work. Better, embrace the work. Take on the cognitive load of becoming more conscious of living in and managing this tension. That is precisely the two Ve'ahavta commands. Be conscious of which glasses you are wearing and when. In the abstract, it is neither better nor worse to focus on sameness or difference. Either lens can be helpful or harmful, increase or decrease our honesty, our vitality, our engagement, our ethics, and morality. The question is why and when. So the command I want to say to Ve'ahavta is about becoming more aware that we are putting on those glasses and interrogating why. When and where do I choose to see like me or not like me, especially when I feel it very strongly? What function does seeing similarity or difference serve for me? Is it helping me face something or avoid something, feel something or not feel something? Am I using similarity or difference to build connection, to increase empathy, to grow, to learn something? Or am I using similarity or difference to avoid confronting a challenge to my values and commitments, or my narratives and beliefs, or my self-image, to avoid feeling vulnerable or responsible. And one more point, and then we'll stop for questions again. It's important to focus especially on fear. What role does fear play in response more usually to difference? And if difference is making me feel afraid, most likely one of three things must be true. One, I'm afraid because I'm genuinely in danger in ways that I can't and shouldn't tolerate. That demands one response. Alternatively, two, I'm afraid, but there's no actual threat. Not everything that's scary is dangerous. Or three, I'm afraid because something is threatening. It's threatening my identity, or it's demanding change of me, or it will cost me something, but either the loss is worth it. On the personal level, for example, if I'm going to make room for another person in my life, I'm going to have to give up closet space. I'm going to have to show up at things I hate, right? On a very trivial, simple level. Or not just that it's worth it to me, but I am morally and religiously obligated to bear with the change or the loss. An example in the personal realm: caring for an aging parent can really challenge our identities as children. Shakes us up. But we're not free morally to refrain from care, even though it involves a loss of the relationship we had or the self I want to see myself as being. And on the larger level, as Jews, we are not ethically permitted to sustain discriminatory or oppressive attitudes, behaviors, and policies to preserve our privileged places in the world or our comfort level with the status quo. We may feel fear, but ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ve'ahavta lo kamocha obligates us to confront the fear and bear the loss. Each of those three circumstances demands a different response. And it demands consciously choosing, how am I going to respond? I'm seeing difference or I'm seeing similarity because something is making me afraid. Is this just fear and there's no threat? Is this a real threat and I have to protect myself? Or is this a real threat and I have to be willing to bear the loss? So let me stop here for some more questions. And then I said I'd come back to the question of God and the role of religion, and that's what I want to conclude with. So do we have any questions on the table at this point?
A lot of really interesting questions and comments also.
Okay.
So let's start with where you just ended, which I think was really, really building off of what Rabbi Sachs wrote about how making peace brings an identity, a crisis of identity, because we've lost the us and the them, so we don't know who we are anymore. And you were talking about the role of fear in not wanting, in motivating us to see someone different from us as other. So there were a few comments here about, our need to want to be part of a zero-sum game, apparently, a human need. So one person's writing about kind of our meritocratic society here in America, and competition is something that we lift up. And if you succeed, it's because you somehow, deserve that space because you're special. You made it and someone else didn't. And she was, commenting on on that, when Obama was saying you didn't build that, right, where he meant you didn't build that alone. There was a group effort, but there was such backlash to the idea that you didn't build it, right? So that was one comment related to this kind of need for a zero-sum game. And then on kind of a more personal level for Jews, someone was reminding, not that we need reminding, but recalling the Charlottesville chant, Jews will not replace us, right? So certainly in the widespread anti-Semitism that has existed for millennia, there's people need to see us in terms of some kind of zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to comment on either of those.
Yeah, I mean, this is, these are examples, I think, which stem from my initial point, which is that this tension is right there in those first verses, the beginning of Genesis, precisely because the stakes are so high, because this tension really is at the heart of so much of the hatred, of anti-Semitism, of racism, of hatred directed toward us, and our own biases and hatreds and prejudices. The first point about the competitiveness and the meritocracy and the zero-sum game, that actually is, I think, partly culturally based and derives from that distinction between Western individualism versus Jewish individuation. And it derives in part from the inability to hold this tension. It is, I can't stress enough how hard it is to really, in practice, hold that we are indeed different from everyone else and unique and separate and also radically connected. And different cultures fall in different places on where they tend to strike that balance. And so Western culture falls very heavily on the differentiation, and I'm a unique individual. Some cultures don't. Some cultures focus much more and value much more the similarity and the collective consciousness. That, where we fall on the spectrum, is not predetermined. That's not inevitable. That's culturally based and individually based on our characters and our choices and how we've been raised in the culture we're brought up in. But it is definitely an expression of this problem, of the difficulty of holding both. And so people will hear, you didn't build that alone, as an attack on their identities, because it's either or. Either I'm connected to others or I'm on my own. Either I did it by myself or I have no claim in it, because it's so hard to hold the both end. So yeah, I think that's right there in the sweet spot of everything I've been talking about.
Let me share another two questions in tandem. So there was someone who wanted to know what you think about Amalek. So I'm reading that as right, that you shared the Torah's commandments to love the other, both within our community and beyond, but the Torah also essentially commands us to hate a particular other, and or at least to keep them forever, permanently in the position of other. And then someone else asked, how far does this really go? There are others that, do we really want to see some commonality there, with the most extreme example being Hitler, but there is evil out there, and how, where do we draw the line?
Okay. Definitely two related questions. So let me take the question as it's been expressed, which is, do we want to see similarity? And the answer is no, we don't, but we have to. Dafka, we don't want to see any similarity. And when we don't, then we deny our own capabilities. Right? It is so easy to look at somebody who is doing something terrible and say that person is completely different from me and I would never do that. And the truth is, we don't know. There's a Hasidic teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that says, if you are shown evil, know that it is within you. That's the radical on the other side, to say, you know, don't, that we can't, we can't say this person is not human. This person is fundamentally different from me, because then I can't protect against what I might do. Maybe I would never do that exactly, right? We are each unique, but I can't tell myself I would never do, you know, I would never feel what someone else feels. I would never be capable of committing anything terrible. That's a dangerous distortion of who we are. Now, the Amalek question, and the limits of the, you know, of love. So first of all, I do want to say, you know, the first thing I noted about fear is it a real threat? I'm not here to say, you know, that nothing is ever actually dangerous. There's evil and there's danger, and sometimes the fear is real, and sometimes we look at somebody and we say that aspect of that person is different from me in ways that I find dangerous and abhorrent, and that's not okay. That may be true. The key is not to deny the humanity of that person, not to deny that there is some connection, or that I might have had a share in creating a world in which such a person exists or is empowered to act. And then there's it opens up a much bigger question. I see a couple of people who were with me on the High Holy Days this year. I talked about this a little bit on Yom Kippur, and what I would say here is there's the one understanding of the function of evil, is precisely pathological dualism. Is that which has lost connection to the larger oneness. Where there is only disconnection, that's the source of evil. But that's we don't have time to go into that in a way that will be comprehensible today. So I'll just bracket for the moment, because I want to come back. I said I would talk about God and the role of religion, and that's where I want to come back to. So we looked at the two Ve'ahavta verses, loving your kinsman, your neighbor, and loving the stranger. There is also, of course, another Ve'ahavta commandment, and that is Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. You shall love your God. And we started by talking about the way in which we are created to be like and unlike God. Betzalmenu, kidmutenu, like but not. So where does God fit in with this? Or where does this similar difference, tension fit in our relationship with God? And I'm sure you can guess by now that my answer will be right at the center, right at the core. To the extent that Judaism has a credo, a core belief, if we have one, it would be the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And this is more than a statement that there aren't other gods. It posits an overarching, underpinning oneness of which we and everyone and everything are part of, expressions of. It's the basis for the sameness side of the same difference dichotomy, right there in the Shema. And for many of us, a lot of the time, I think it's why we want religion. It's why we go to shul. It's what faith is all about, right? We want and need to feel part of something bigger than ourselves. We want to feel part of that larger oneness. That's the mystical quest. We want our consciousness to be raised so that we're aware of it, and we experience ourselves as part of something bigger. But 2 points about that. One, the Jewish notion of oneness is complicated. Oneness with respect to God is about largely the union of opposites. So the classic rabbinic interpretation of the Shema is that the two divine names, or one classic rabbinic interpretation, is that the two names, Adonai and Eloheinu, hint at different aspects of the divinity, mercy and judgment. And when we recite the Shema, we say, these two seemingly opposite gods are one God, right? Union of opposites. When we speak of God as one, it doesn't mean monolithic sameness. God's oneness includes the totality of all possible diversity in a harmonious whole. So, of course, one of religion's goal is connection in general, connection to the oneness of God, connection to the people Israel, connection to the people next to us. That's all good and true. It's important, and it's not enough. Religion is also supposed to help us express, confront, and tolerate difference, because that's also how we encounter God, as different. And that takes us back to this past week's parsha, where those Ve'ahavta commands are located, Parshat Kedoshim. Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. Leviticus 19:2. You shall be, or really strive to be, holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy. If the Shema is as close as we have to a credo, that verse, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall strive to be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy, is about as close to an elevator speech mission statement as the Torah gets. Be on the path to what we call holiness, Kedusha. Full stop. Now, what is holiness? Based on the scholarship of Rudolf Otto and Mary Oliver, many scholars believe that the Hebrew term for holy, kadosh, has its roots in otherness. It refers to set apartness, difference. And as applied to God, kedusha, holiness, may refer to the paradoxical quality of God being completely other, categorically different and unique, and radically connected to humanity. This is the fundamental paradox at the heart of prayer. How can human beings talk to God? We are fundamentally, categorically different. God is eternal, we are mortal. God is infinite, we are limited. All the ways, right? God is fundamentally, categorically other. And that meaning of other gets expressed in a whole variety of commentaries that struggle with, you shall be holy for I am holy. If holiness means God is completely other than me, then how can I be holy, right? And we get lots of commentaries with some variation of, don't think your holiness is like God's holiness. It's different holiness. It's not the same holiness. It's lower holiness, right? It's sort of asymptotic. You are striving to be. You will never get there. That's the problem. Now, taking the two together, the oneness of the Shema and the otherness of holiness, teach us that this dialectic we've been talking about is contained within the divine. God is inherently the oneness of all and uniquely different. Both and at the same time. And as we've seen, we are made in God's image. We share with God that paradoxical tension of being both same and other. Within the divine, that paradox is expressed perfectly. God is inherently holy. Within us, God knows, we do not express it perfectly. And so we are commanded to strive for holiness, but we are not inherently holy. We're on a path to holiness. And that path leads directly through the thicket of like and unlike, oneness and otherness. Perhaps even for human beings, the very definition of holiness is those moments when we get the balance right, when we see it accurately and we act on it. When we lose the duality, not only do we lose our moral center vis-a-vis other people, we end up with a kind of idolatry. Because just as if we see only sameness or only difference with respect to other people, we're not really seeing them or ourselves accurately, so too with God. If we see ourselves as individuals or as Jews, as radically separate, the sovereign self, the chosen people with no connection to others, with no responsibility to others, then we are not seeing the oneness of God. But if godliness looks and sounds only like me or us, and we can't see the image of God in the others who are different from me, we're also not seeing and hearing God. We're seeing a constricted, narrow God made in our image, and that's idolatry. In other words, for religion to do the theological work that it needs to do, we need pluralism, both among and even within particular religious traditions. We need people who worship God differently than we do, and we need to understand they're worshiping the same God. We are approaching Shavuot, more than halfway there from Pesach, where we reenact Sinai. And I want to say that the rabbinic understanding of revelation of Torah similarly embraces this duality. And it demands the same balancing. On the one hand, the Sinai event is the unifying event of the Jewish people. So many midrashim emphasize the coherence of us, that Israel merited to receive Torah at Sinai because we were as one, unified, one people. Everyone stood at Sinai, everyone. Not only every single person of that generation, all ages, all genders, all levels of status and class, but every Jew, including Jews by choice of every generation across time. Deuteronomy 2:3, not with our ancestors did Adonai make this covenant, but with us, we the living here today. That applies in every generation. It's something we all share, every single one of us. That's the similarity. And an equal number of midrashim highlight that revelation was a unique, singular event for every single person. Whether it's the notion that God sort of titrated or calibrated the divine voice according to the capacity of each individual to hear it, or to midrashim that God appeared and spoke to each individual differently in a different appearance, a different voice, or the idea that that the Torah shows a different face. Shivim panim b'Torah, there are 70 faces of the Torah, to every single Jew. We each have our own little share in Torah, a unique insight that only we will see in the Torah, right? One way or another, we have both. We were all there at Sinai. We all heard the same thing, and every person heard something different. It's exactly the same tension. Our Torah is similar to everyone else's and unique to us. That's what it means to study Torah, is to sit in that tension. So I want to wind down there by saying that in a sense, religion's job is itself to function as a kind of other, not in the sense of being separate from or irrelevant to secular life, but other in the sense of countercultural, of challenging prevailing norms and values, of standing as both a goad to change and a ballast to resist fashion and mob rule. It's there precisely to push us to ask constantly that question of what's the same and what's different. What's the same in my Judaism from my ancestors? What's different? What's the same in the way I practice and someone else practices? What's different? What's the same in my religion and another, and what's different? How am I the same and different from every person in this room and all the people I don't yet know? And I would even go so far as to say that we can only morally justify our particularity to the extent that our particularity emerges, the way in which we as Jews are different emerges from the awareness that we are part of a humanity that on some level is all the same and allows us to hold both. At its best, religion is at its best when it trains us and it nudges us and it forces us to see through both these lenses at one and the same time. And it's precisely by looking here at how any religious expression manages this tension that we can sort of evaluate and sense the extent to which God is present. Because when we lose that tension, we've lost the connection with God. And I would say if there's a single message from religion that we desperately need right now, that's our greatest hope. I think it's this. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and Kedushim Tihiyu, Ki Kadosh Ani Adonai Elohechem. God is one and God is other, and so is everybody else. Judaism requires, when it's authentic, it requires and teaches the ability in general to handle complexity and polarities, but very specifically this one, to know and honor the oneness and to know and honor the difference. So we have just like 3-4 minutes for final questions. I'll stop there. Julia, any last words from anyone?
You just said so much. Well, I guess maybe I'll just throw out one thing for you to address in 2 minutes, which is how have we come so far from our tradition's kind of happy embrace of a multiplicity of views, right? All the way back to Hillel and Shammai and all of the other machlokot, all of the other disagreements that are preserved with total comfort in our ancient sources. And and then someone shared even the modern joke about 2 Jews and 3 opinions. Like, we've always been happy that way, but we're not anymore.
Yeah. So first of all, I think I'm resisting romanticizing the past. It's not that those were ever totally easy. This has always been hard. But for all the reasons that I identified earlier, Jonathan Sacks's list and what I added to it, this tension is really hard right now. It is just really hard. And it's manifesting in the way that we double down on divisiveness within Judaism. It's not just with the way we see the other out there. We're turning each other into others, precisely because it is so hard to manage in our time, for all of these reasons. And we've become, I think, less good at holding polarity generally. And that may be a symptom of being overworked and overburdened and just having too much information thrown at us all the time. But I think it's, by the way, something that in this very particular moment in time, having lived through such a divisive and difficult period in America, and then all the impact of COVID-19, we are exhausted. And when we're exhausted, it's much harder to hold tensions like these. And I would say we have a religious obligation for self-care, because if we don't, we will be lazy about this. And if we are lazy about this, we will cause harm. So I think it's important for all of us to think about the ways in which we are world weary and just exhausted, and what it would take for us to have the energy to actually sit with these polarities and hold them, because it is work. And it is, I believe, at the core of our religious work.
Thank you so much. I can't help but add that, this is the first time in history that we're living with technology that's designed to, algorithms that are designed to emphasize difference. And we've fallen prey to that in such an extreme way, but all the more so your challenge stands. So the chat is full of thanks to you for, you've framed something that we all deal with every day, both interpersonally and much, much more broadly. In religious terms, you've brought in sociology, you've brought in psychology, you've brought in God language, and it was so nuanced and so helpful. So thank you for really allowing us to reflect very deeply in this Jewish text-based way on this really defining struggle of our time. Thank you so much for this teaching today.
Thank you.
I hope, since I didn't get to make announcements before, I hope people will stick around for literally 1 minute. I just want to tell you a couple of exciting things for this group in particular. I don't normally announce other programs, but I really want to tell tell you folks about a few things coming up. This coming Sunday, May 2nd, we have a full evening of learning, which is sponsored by the Greater Washington Jewish community, but open to everyone, on racial justice and Jewish values. So kind of obvious interest to people learning with us here today and in this series. And similarly, on Wednesday, May 12th, we have a panel program, which I think is pretty unprecedented as far as I know in the Jewish community, talking about reparations for Black Americans and what Holocaust reparations can teach us about, as we enter seriously into that debate. And finally, I just want to tell you, we have such an exciting summer series planned for you. So well, I'll just give you the title. It's hot off the presses, not even on the presses actually. It's called A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. So you will hear more about it for sure, but starting June 7th and going through mid-August, we're really excited about that. And just in light of that new program that we're putting together, we actually really wanted to ask those of you who've been studying with us on Mondays for some feedback, not so much on the content, because let's face it, we know our scholars are amazing, as you saw today. But of course, we're always happy for your feedback on content. But actually, we have some questions for you on, on structure, kind of how the series is put together, how each session runs, and other kind of logistical and packaging and formatting related issues. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that as we are putting together a new series. So you'll be getting a survey from us on that, and it should just take a couple minutes. So thanks to everyone for coming. We hope to see you next Monday. We'll have a pre-Shavuot session with Dr. Amy Kamenofsky, looking at the book of Ruth through this lens of otherness and inclusion and identity formation. I think very connected, at least in some ways, to what Rabbi Uhrbach discussed today. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you so much once again to Rabbi Uhrbach for your brilliant and moving teaching today.